And the good news here is that just like Jacob, even though there's been some very hard years, Jacob can look back on it and say, God was working in my life, and look where he's brought me. Look where he's brought me. And so that could be the same thing with us. If we just realize God is taking us somewhere, and he could be using all those difficult, hard years, and he can use that. We may not see how, but he can. Hello and welcome to Reasoning Through the Bible. My name is Glenn. I'm here with Steve. We are going through the book of Genesis. We've come to a very interesting part of the book, chapter 46. And with this, Jacob has reconciled with his brothers, told them who he was, sent wagons down to Canaan and are bringing them to Egypt. And we're not going to read the section where it lists off the 70 names. It's an exercise in pronunciation, but it tells us there the names of all of Jacob and his 12 sons and all of those people, so that this is the place where they go to Egypt. And of course, it turns into a bad situation where they're there for 400 years and they come out with Moses. So we'll pick up the story at Genesis chapter 46, starting in verse 28, says this. Now he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive." Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come unto me, and the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, 'What is your occupation?' you shall say, 'Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians." Joseph has this joyful and very emotional reunion with his father Jacob, and I'm sure you can imagine this was a very tender moment. Jacob had thought that Joseph had been killed many years earlier. Now he finds out that he is alive again, and not only that, in a very prominent position in Egypt. And so we have here the picture of a resurrection figure, both of the resurrection of Christ and the regeneration of Christians. Talked about that in our last session. Joseph tells his family here to tell Pharaoh that they keep livestock. Now, I find here, Steve, this land of Goshen is very fertile land. We saw last time that Pharaoh had said, "Oh, you can have the best." So they gave him the land that had the best grasses and the best ability to survive there. So they're given this great land. What else do we know about this? Where he says there, "Tell Pharaoh that you're a shepherd."
Joseph is wanting to assure that his family gets the land of Goshen to live in and to prosper. Joseph is looking at this from a long-term situation, not just a situation where they're there just for the famine. So this land of Goshen is a fertile area. It's to the east of the Nile, and it has one of the branches of the Nile that runs through it. And it's a prime area to raise sheep, goats, and livestock. So Joseph is telling them, look, I'm going to tell Pharaoh that y'all are shepherds, which they are. They're nomadic people. When you come before him, you tell him the same thing. It's all in my idea that Joseph is trying to make sure that they secure this land of Goshen, because after all, even though Joseph is over all the area, he still has to get Pharaoh's permission for certain things, and deeding this land to them is one of them.
So the main thing I think we learn here is that God's hand of providence is still on this people. God is providing to them the best of the land of Egypt, where they can prosper there and grow to be a great nation. So God works it out to where Joseph, Pharaoh, everyone allows Israel to go and grow in this land of Goshen. Now, this idea of tell Pharaoh that you're shepherds, and it says in that last verse that every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. So that gives us 2 or 3 possibilities here for the kind of the dynamics for why they would say that. Well, one possibility is because the Egyptians didn't want to be shepherds. Now, here's a whole bunch of shepherds. We can put them over there kind of out of the way and hire them to keep all of our livestock for us. And they might like that because the Egyptians might not want to do that job. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that they would, because they didn't like shepherding, they say, get out over there somewhere. And that separated Israel off into this land of Goshen where they wouldn't intermarry with the Egyptians, which had always been an issue, is don't intermarry with them. So that would, because they're a little bit loathsome, that separates them out to where they're physically not close to the Egyptians. And then they could grow over there without becoming part of the Egyptian culture. And there's still another possibility that in history, we learned that there were some of the pharaohs that were not ethnic Egyptians, that they were from a different people, the Hyksos people. And it's entirely possible that this particular Pharaoh was of a different ethnic origin, this Hyksos origin, that were shepherds. Whereas when this says the Egyptians found it loathsome to be a shepherd, it's possible that the Pharaoh was not a native Egyptian, and he might, here's somebody that is of my kindred. Here's somebody that sees the world like I do. They're shepherds too, just like my family was. And so he might have a little bit of affection for them. So some combination of those 3 is why they would be telling Pharaoh that we are shepherds. But the main point, as we said, is that gets them over into this prosperous land, this land of Goshen, the best of Egypt, to where they could grow their livestock and prosper as a nation, which was, again, God's hand of providence. So when they go here, there's 75 of them. And when they come out at the time of the Exodus, it's upwards of a couple of million. And so they are indeed, by that point, a great nation. So moving on then to the next chapter, chapter 47, we find here that Jacob's family is going to settle in Goshen. Steve, can you read the first 12 verses of Genesis 47?
Then Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers and their flocks and their herds and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. He took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? So they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob and presented him to Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many years have you lived? So Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor have they attained the years that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had ordered. Joseph provided his father and his brothers and all his father's household with food according to their little ones.
In this section, Pharaoh accepts Jacob and his family and gives them the land of Goshen to live in with Pharaoh's approval. Pharaoh talks with Joseph's father, Jacob, and seems to be pleased. The tone here is that it feels like Pharaoh is enjoying having this older gentleman there. Jacob says he is 130 years old, but has not lived as long as his ancestors. In verse 9, Jacob tells Pharaoh that the years of his life have been few and unpleasant, or some of the translations say evil or difficult. And I notice here, Steve, that Jacob is not bragging about his accomplishments. He's saying, I haven't lived as long as my ancestors, and the years I have lived have been unpleasant. They've been very difficult. And I notice here what he's not doing is puffing himself up. He's not bragging on his accomplishments. He didn't come in here and say, yeah, I really took advantage of my brother, and I was more shrewd than him, and I also cheated Laban out of a lot of stuff. And he didn't say any of that. He's a changed man. Few and difficult have been my lives. So he's much more humble at this point. And so God has changed Jacob into a very humble man, don't you think?
Absolutely. And as Jacob has come in here, it says that Jacob blesses Pharaoh. We see the two different types of structure in that Pharaoh is the king over the land, but with the Hebrews, their structure is that the oldest or the eldest, the patriarch, is the one who is over all of everyone. So Jacob blesses Pharaoh. And it also shows there on Jacob's attitude, and that when it says few and difficult, that term difficult is sometimes translated evil. It doesn't really mean evil. It means calamity in the Hebrew. And we can tell from Jacob's history that it was very much of a calamity when he was staying with his uncle Laban in those time periods of his life, thinking that his favorite son had been killed and such. I think Jacob is just now, he's toward the end of his life, and he's just glad that things are finally starting to kind of come together, although he is outside of the land.
When Pharaoh asked Jacob how old he is, he says that he hasn't lived as long as his fathers, but the years he has lived have been unpleasant or difficult. And I think we can identify with that, at least many of us can, is that Jacob said it's been a hard life. Jacob says it's been a hard life. And I think there's a lot of people maybe listening to us could feel the same way, saying, yeah, it's been really tough. And I've met people kind of really had a hard life. And the good news here is that just like Jacob, even though there's been some very hard years, Jacob can look back on it and say, God was working in my life, and look where he's brought me. Look where he's brought me. And so that could be the same thing with us. If we just realize God is taking us somewhere, and he could be using all those difficult, hard years, and he can use that. We may not see how, but he can. Then the other thing I see in here, Steve, is that twice in this passage, it says that Jacob blessed Pharaoh. It says it twice. He comes in and he blesses them. He talks with them. And then when he leaves, he blesses them again. So I find this interesting. Jacob is a follower of the one true God. Pharaoh is not. Is it okay for a Christian to give a blessing to a non-Christian? That's what we have here. Pharaoh was helping Israel. He was doing something good for Israel, and by giving them this best of this land. So I think that's why Jacob can say, bless you. So I think even though Pharaoh was not a true believer, not a follower of God, he was doing things that blessed God's people, that benefited God's people. So Jacob could say, bless you for that. And I think oftentimes Christians, we get a little too hard sometimes on non-Christians, whereas sometimes God can use non-believers to further his kingdom and help out the believers, and we could thank them for that and give a blessing to a non-believer. Your thoughts on that, Steve?
I think that's staying right in line with what God has done and at different times and what we've actually looked at. God prospered Potiphar's house. He wasn't a believer, but he prospered his house through Joseph. Abimelech with Abraham, and then also later another time, God came to them and warned them as to what's going on, what Abraham was doing, and then later what Isaac was doing. And whenever they heeded what God's word was to them, then he ended up blessing them for doing that. So God himself will bless people that don't necessarily believe in him. We've seen that in just the stories that we've looked at here in Genesis.
I would agree 100%. We have here Jacob being very grateful for what Pharaoh's doing. My last question in this section is, if I ask myself, why in the world would Pharaoh give this land to these people? And the answer, when I thought about it for a while, is because God wanted him to. I think it was God's hand of providence again that was working things out to where Pharaoh then has this desire to bless the people of Israel. And so I think it really is God's hand of providence. Why would Pharaoh do this? Because God wanted him to. Let's go on to the next section, starting in verse 13, says this. Now there was no food in all the land, because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they had bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence? For our money is gone." Then Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys. And he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. When that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There is nothing left for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, and they lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. At the harvest you give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own for seed and for the field and for your food and for those of your household, and as for food for your little ones." So they said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's slaves." Joseph made a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priest did not become Pharaoh's. We have Joseph doing some business there. So Steve, essentially, if we were to summarize all that, what was Joseph doing with that whole section? What he ends up doing here, he has food and they don't, so he sells it to them, and he takes all their money by selling them food. And then the next year they sell all their livestock and he buys that from them and in exchange for food. And the next year they come to him and say, "We don't have any money left. We don't have any livestock left. Then buy our land and us as slaves." And he does so. He then sets them up. What's interesting to me is at the end, it's like you say, sort of a feudal system, is he takes and he requires 20%, 1/5, for Pharaoh, which is basically national tax. They get to keep 4/5. And what I find interesting here, Steve, is that one, Joseph is very shrewd. These people are in a situation where they don't have a choice. Joseph is working for Pharaoh, and his job is to make a profit for Pharaoh, so he does so. But in the end, after all of that, he ends up taxing them 20%, which, if we remember from earlier in the book, was the same percentage that they had been taxed before. So he doesn't turn around and then continue and turn it into like an abusive situation where he says, okay, I'm going to keep 4/5 and you keep 1/5. No, the tax was not burdensome. Matter of fact, if we compare to today, there's many countries around the world have a lot greater tax than 20%. So the first thing I think of, though, Steve, when I read this, when Joseph acquires all the money and the livestock and the land and the people, we live in a day to day where people talk a lot about what is fair. Especially newer generations, they talk a lot about, are things fair? Is it fair to people to do this? So I ask you, Steve, is it fair? Is it fair for Joseph to do this? He had all the food because he had been given visions from God on, hey, save this up, and they didn't. And so therefore, he's in a position to be able to trade food for all these things. Is that fair?
It's fair because he had set aside the provisions so that the people could be fed during this time. It's also fair because the people are proportionately getting food back as to what they're putting into it versus Joseph just giving the food out as the people come without getting some sort of other reciprocation for it. It takes money to run an economy. So Joseph, through this of getting property from them in order to pay for the food, he's also setting among them that, look, the government can provide for you because we knew that this famine was coming. We taxed you in the beginning so that you could have the provisions, but it's not just going to be something that's just going to be given out to you. Joseph is taking care of them, but it's because of his preparations beforehand that Egypt has enough food that can actually sustain them through the rest of this famine for the next 5 years.
I submit it is fair and right for Joseph to do this for a couple of reasons. One is because he was working for Pharaoh. His job was to do what was best for the country as a whole, including Pharaoh and the government. And as you said, Steve, the government does need some money in order to run. And with this, he had been taxing them, if you remember, 1/5, 20%, and saved up so much that it was so much they couldn't count it anymore. Well, the people had to have seen this, and they had 4/5. They could have saved some too, but apparently many of them did not. And so that's one lesson, is they didn't take and save up when they could have, or at least it's entirely possible. Another one is, if we notice in this passage, the money that he gets, Joseph didn't keep it. He gave it into the federal coffers, the government's treasury. So that went into Pharaoh's treasury, not Joseph's pocket. So Joseph personally was not profiting from this. He made sure the country profited from this. The other thing is, I see here, Steve, the Bible actually talks quite a bit about the poor and how to treat the poor and what we should do with the poor. We could do more than one session about all of the things that the Bible says about poverty and how to prevent poverty and what churches and governments should do about poor people. And we won't take all of that time here, but just a small few verses that'll give us a flavor for what the Bible teaches about how should we treat the poor. One is, Jesus told us the poor are going to always be there. They will always be there. Mark 14:7. So yes, we should, as Christians, try to go and help the poor. That's one of the things we're commanded to do. Paul in Galatians says that when he was working with Peter and James and John, they said, as you go out to the Gentiles, remember the poor. Galatians 2:10. And he said, that's what I wanted to do. And in the several times in Acts, they take up collections for the poor. So Christians are commanded to take care of the poor, but they're always going to be here. and we're never going to get rid of poverty. We can help some individual poor people, and that's what we should do. That's what we're commanded to do. So all of that, if we look over the centuries at what Christians have done, it's Christians that have the ministries to feed the poor. And so Christians have a long and good history for reaching out to the poor. And that's a good thing we should do. That said, there's more than that said about the poor in the Bible. For example, it says in 1st and 2nd Timothy, specifically 1 Timothy 5, and in 2 Timothy, it says to be very careful about the church's money and who gets money given out to them. It says only give money to poor people who are not able to work. If they are able to work, don't give them anything. It says if you do, they will learn to be idle. It says in 1 Timothy 5:13. So giving money to people just because they're poor, if they're able to work, it teaches them to be idle. So says the inspired word of God. What we should do is to have wise people in charge of things and say, are they able to work? Do they have a family that can take care of them? If so, then the community money is not going to be given to them. They can go work or their family can support them. That way there's enough money left over in the community pot to be able to give to people. It says are widows indeed, the people that are legitimately poor, that are not able to work and don't have family, then there's enough to support them. The way many of our governments do is exactly the opposite. Just because people have a lower income, here's some money. And that way there's never enough to support the people that are legitimately poor. So we have things all flipped around in our day, whereas if we did it through wise people in the biblical way, there'd be less tax, because oftentimes in our country, we're taxing people not 20%, not 30 or 40, but 50 or more in order to give to people that we're teaching them to be idle. Whereas the scripture says if they're able to work, in fact, in Thessalonians, it says, he who does not work should not eat. So scripture takes a very, very severe standpoint on the poor. It says we are obligated to help the poor, but it also says that we should teach them to work. And if they don't work, they should not eat. That's what it says. The other thing I find here, Steve, is that in verses 18 and 19, in this passage, the people of Egypt come to Joseph with a request. And it says, we will not hide from my Lord that our money is all spent and the cattle of my lords. There's nothing left for my Lord except our bodies and our lands. And they ask to be bought, in verse 19, by us and our land for food. So here's these people coming to Joseph, asking to be bought as slaves. And Steve, you and I did a 3-part series on slavery, and we just encourage our listeners to go look there. But this was one of the passages that we brought up in that 3-part series, because here were people that were hungry. They didn't have anything left. And they said, please buy us and buy us as slaves so that we can eat. Joseph then does so. He takes them and turns them into, okay, here's a situation where, as you said, feudal system. But I find it interesting, Steve, that they were wanting to be bought as slaves. Joseph does it very benevolently, as the law of Moses later commands to do, which is to treat all people fairly and equally, even the slaves. But what he does is he doesn't tax them any more than he'd been doing back in the previous chapters. That they still had the 20% tax that they'd had back 10 or 12 chapters ago. So I find it interesting here that, one, they were wanting to be bought as slaves. And two, when he did, he actually treated them with respect, and he treated them the same way he had been treating them, because he was working for Pharaoh. And I just find this to be an example of how a godly man in a difficult situation would be good to all people in all circles.
As you've been pointing out too, this is a voluntary way for them to come and say, we want you to take care of us. We want to indenture ourselves to Egypt so that we can be taken care of. It wasn't something that the Egyptians or that Joseph was imposing on them. They were doing it voluntarily because they had run out of food and they had run out of the way to be able to produce that food. And I think you brought out a very good point early on, if they had set aside provisions on their own in the 7 years of greatness that they had, fatness that they had in the land, and they had enough food stored for themselves, then they weren't going to be put into this situation. It says here that all of Egypt was turned over this way, which gives you a picture that they didn't do it, but it's something that's voluntary. And if they would have provided for themselves, they weren't put in the situation where they had to go and do this. So I think that's a key part to point out here as well.
And in our modern times, there's a lot of course, sensitivity around slavery. But I find here what's really interesting is that in this situation, Joseph says, okay, well, I'll do what you ask. You've asked me to turn you into an indentured servant or to buy you as a slave, but I'm going to do so. But here's the seed, and I'm only going to tax you 20%, and you keep 80%. And again, in our day, a lot of times we flip it around and we don't require them to work. And that requires us to then tax people 50% or more so that we can turn around and give it back out again. And people learn to be idle. Whereas this much more fair system, because they were encouraged to work or you do not eat, like it says in Thessalonians. And in doing so, the tax system is more fair for everybody all the way around. So that brings us to a point where we're going to stop for today. We're at a point in the story where Jacob is about to die. Jacob is quite old, and he's going to make a very special request of Joseph before he dies, and one that we can find very interesting, and it applies to some times today and some theology that goes throughout the Bible. So tune in next time with us as we continue to reason through the book of Genesis.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. May God bless you.